The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello, I'm Carl Seidel, host of The People's View. The show is sponsored by the Nashua City Republican Committee, and if you like to attend our meetings, they're the second Thursday of every month at 6:30 at the Crown Plaza. And if you want to find out more about our organization, you can go to nashuagop.org to see our website and learn about the events that we have.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's edition of The People's View. My name is Bill Ohm. I'll be your host for this version of The People's View, and with me are Steve Negron, a congressional candidate, Dave Schoneman, former alderman in Nashua and candidate for Senate, and my good friend Carl Seidel, former state representative, along with myself. So today's topic is going to be primarily the votes coming up in various elections. The main election that we're facing here in New Hampshire is the election of the votes for the State House in Thursday. So I want to talk a bit about the process that led us to this set of votes. By this point, many of the committees have heard a public hearing on the bills that are proposed for their committees. These are changes in state law. After the public hearing's been completed, then the committee takes a look at the testimony, goes to a deliberative session where they debate among themselves, and then make a recommendation on these bills as to whether they're deserving of passing in the House and being sent to the Senate, or whether there's just not enough merit and they should be sent back to the dustbin. So the votes coming up tomorrow are the first round of major votes by the bills that have passed the committees. And what I'd like to do today is talk about some of the important votes that affect those of us here in Nashua. And the first one is actually a bipartisan vote on school building aid, House Bill 176. The situation we had on school building aid is that back in 2010, the state legislature was way overwhelmed with expenses. An $800 million deficit was being tossed into the budget with no means of paying for it. The Republicans got elected in 2010, had to clean up the spending mess. And unfortunately, a lot of the spending that was deserving couldn't be funded during that period, one of which was school building aid, which is about $50 million. Since that time, in the last 4 years in particular, the Republicans have controlled the legislature, have controlled the spending priorities with support from the governor. We've got a balanced budget last term, and we actually ran a surplus. So now, having had a surplus and anticipating another surplus for the next 2 years, there's been some thought that we could recover some of the money that was previously sent to the cities and towns and give the folks a break on their property taxes. So the first item is school building aid. There's a proposal to allocate $50 million of state money back to the cities and towns for school building aid. This can be repairs and improvements or new structures. Bipartisan bill. I expect that to pass the House, and I think that's good for the city of Nashua. What do you guys think?
I think that, when I was an alderman, we have very, very tough budget issues here in the city of Nashua. And any time that we look to do something like improve our schools, we didn't have the state money that we used to have. It became a burden. One thing that I would just like to point out, while I think this is a good bill, we have to make sure that it's sustainable. I'm hoping that if the $50 million number is really sustainable. There's some talk about maybe making some changes in tax rates in the state that could cause, a reduction in our revenues. And if that were to occur, then we've committed to a $50 million annual number. It's not one time, it's annual. Is that correct?
Right. It's an ongoing bill. It would not only mandate $50 million, but have a floor of at least $50 million in the subsequent years. And you raise a very key point, Dave, because sometimes when we have a surplus, we like to do one-time spending, which happened under the last term. But now we've got a situation where the spending is going to be baked into the law, and that would be very difficult to reverse should times not be as good as we've had in the past 4 years.
Right.
And we want to make sure that it's being used for that school and reduction of local taxes.
Yeah.
Right.
Either or.
Sure. I think that's a problem. Anytime an entity, whether it's a state getting money from the state government or the state getting money from the federal government, it becomes an issue where they become dependent on that now, right? So you lose an ability to be resourceful because your first argument is, well, don't worry, we're getting X already from somebody. And I think that has a potential to take the ability of a city or a town or even a state from the federal government to be less prudent with the money, right? Because to your point, Dave, is let's say there will be lean years. It's cyclical. Well, all of a sudden now somebody like Nashua that's being dependent on a $50 million bucket of money coming down. Now we don't have it. And if I get used to that, then all of a sudden now the other things are going to happen. So it would be better if that we work within our means. And then if there is a surplus, and we should look at it as a surplus, what are those things that are, whether it's an out of cycle or some things that we've been meaning to do, that we do that as a one-off, and not to your point. I think that's an excellent point, not to get so used to it, because if we codify it, then all of a sudden now there's an expectation, and all of a sudden now we're going to put ourselves in a situation that we may now have this upside down situation. We don't have the money to give to the city.
Exactly. And we should never forget that this is all about politics too, right? Politics and money. So what I learned in politics is you always have to kind of wonder, what's the backstory? What else is going on here? When the left hand does this, what's the right hand doing? And I think that one of the things that if we look carefully at the history of some of the spenders in Concord now, I think we see a desire for an income tax. And what better way to set up an income tax or a sales tax than to overpromise based on revenues that in the future won't be there. So the game scenario could be, well, let's put this money into the budget, let's give it to the cities and towns, and then, oh, too bad, we've lost the revenues, we have no option. And meanwhile, I fear that sometimes people are setting up the no option scenario so that ultimately we say, well, the only solution is income tax or sales tax. Right. We've seen efforts to bring in income tax. We saw the family leave. We talked about that last week, where there's this desire to tax earnings. That's an income tax. And it seems small and benign, but this is going to grow. And
you
we
say
have
the
to be
camel's
very,
nose under
very
the tent.
careful.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we see that in all these other states that surround us in a way. I mean, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, it all started with just a 0.5% interest or a 1% interest, and now it's up 7, 8, 9%.
You have to sustain it, right?
You have to sustain it.
That's right.
That's the problem.
And Nashua does have a lot of money that they're going to have to put into schools, because we have Elm Street School that has to be done. Or make a whole replacement for that. And even Pennachuck, I guess, needs a lot of renewal or something.
Clearly, the schools in Nashua need a lot of work. One thing I think we need to remember in the city of Nashua, and maybe elsewhere too, is we need to take a look at enrollment. Enrollment in Nashua has been declining for a long time. And we've never closed a school, or at least not in recent history have we closed a school. And while at the same time we're identifying these projects that we have to do, I think we also, if we're going to be wise, the city of Nashua needs to look at consolidating some of these schools, really. Because if enrollment is down, and enrollment is down, I understand, like 2,000 students over the last 10 years or so. I'm not sure if those numbers are 100% accurate. But let's kind of go with that for a little bit. Some of our schools only have 400 kids in them. If we've lost 2,000, clearly we could have closed several schools and kept the others with the same density. So we haven't closed any. And I believe strongly in making sure we fund infrastructure, especially school infrastructure. It's very, very important. But we have to not just believe that money grows on trees and that we can just do this all the time. So while I think it's a good idea, I'm a little bit leery about how. I would probably vote for that if I were up there. But I'm a little leery about what's going to happen in the future, because I don't see in this case any downsizing of our school district, which I think is the numbers would justify. And instead I see an ever increasing budget for schools, and I see an ever increasing need for school projects.
Well,
and it just raises some concern.
the superintendent already said that he's going to have a 3-point-something% increase in his budget.
Right.
And nobody's discussing what we already owe. Have we paid off the high school? Or have we paid off anything? How many bonds are still active? You know? So there's a whole lot of information that we lack on what Nashua has to do with that money. But you're right. We have to make sure that people are going to use this, if the money comes from the state, for school building, and they don't have any need for it, that they don't spend it on something else.
Exactly, because it's always politics.
Right.
Yeah. Politics is money and influence.
Yeah.
And it's not for the good of the citizens, frankly.
Yeah.
It's for the good of the people who are spending the money and building the influence. That's what it comes down to. So when folks at home who are watching this consider contacting their representative or being aware of what's going on in Concord, they need to remember that people do view it as a game. And if they get a win, it doesn't mean it's a win for you.
Right.
It means it's a win for them.
Right.
So just bear that in mind.
No. Good
bear
point.
that in mind when we look at any of these things.
On the topic of spending money on something else, that brings us into the next interesting bill coming up for a vote, which is House Bill 497, relative to the payment by the state of a portion of the retirement system contributions of the cities and towns. So right now, the city is obligated to pay not only the salaries, but the benefits, and part of the benefits are the pensions. And this bill says, well, we'd like the state, since they've got all this money, and they're so generous now with the $50 million of school building aid, why don't we be a little more generous with broader aid? Like, why don't you send us some money to help pay for our obligations on our workers' pensions? So here's a bill that would say the state would provide 15% of the cost of local pensions forever. So this is an interesting topic. See, in the past, when times were flush and the costs of government were somewhat lower, the state had contributed up to 35% of the cities and towns' pension requirements. Then back in 2008, 2010, when the spending went through the roof and the economy was in trouble, this was one of the things that the legislature had to cut back on, that we couldn't afford the subsidies for local pensions. So now the state's done well under the management of the last 4 years, and there's a request to add this permanent spending to the general fund. Now, many of us, and many of the Republicans in the legislature feel, as you do, Dave, that this is kind of a risky item to mandate it going on and on and on, and they're worried about not having that money properly spent. Would this not be used to cut back the spending of the city by getting some money to the pensions, or would this money be used to just increase
spending?
Increase spending, right? So there's an amendment. Carol McGuire, my good friend, who's still in the legislature.
I used to be chair of that committee. No?
Yes, chair, right, ED&A, has an amendment. And her amendment would require that the money that the state would give back to cities and towns be used for property tax relief. So we're paying out of property taxes for these pensions. Let's use that money to give some relief of the people paying the property tax and not overspend what's required by the cities and towns.
One of the things that I wonder about, we've been playing around with this pension problem ever since I was up there in 2008, and they haven't decided. You have to do something to modernize the whole pension system. I would like to see an amendment on that to say that they have to change the pension system for new employees from here on, and have, like most of us did when we were working or still are working, you had a 401k. So that's the way to go. You have to have people share right from the beginning. You can't promise them everything.
Well, yeah, those defined pension plans are, have gone off by the way. So it's just very difficult for industry or a company to sustain that, right? So even in the military, right? So the military has gone off. When we had a defined pension plan, you work 20 years and you'd get your retirement. Now it's different. Now it's changing. Now it is morphing where it is now an individual's responsibility to participate in there. And I think that becomes a little bit more of a responsibility on the individual to make sure that if I do want to have something at the end of whatever that period is, I've vested in that, and I take an active role, whether it's however my money, what kind of stock A, B, or C, whatever the case may be. And I think, that there's a belief out there that, in the day of my parents, right, that they go work for a company on day one, they're there for 30 years, right, and they walk out and they get a nice watch and they have a pension. Well, it's unfortunate, but those days are gone for the most part. And so now you have to look at some things that you can't keep on doing the same thing over and over because it's just not sustainable. Right.
And you have to count on that kind of a thing for your own pension, but also the benefits that go along with it. I work for a very big company, and fortunately, I got the benefits to continue after retirement, but not everybody does that.
That's correct.
And then they have to go into the Medicare, the Obamacare remnants, and you can hear all that. And well, that gets into another problem we might discuss later about Medicare in general.
Absolutely.
You got to have something where people can control their future a little bit and control the costs.
But you're right. That whole during the campaign, we talked about making it consumer driven. Right. About put it in the hands of Dave. If Dave wants to have an MRI, then he should choose where that MRI is. Right. And if he's paying for it, then that's his responsibility. And we just don't have that. Right. We have no visibility. We have no transparency. And then we get an explanation of benefits. We have no idea what just that procedure costs. So I think that's a topic for another day. But
it all comes down to responsibility.
Yes,
I think you use that word. I think that
responsibility.
we need to be responsible for ourselves, because if we're responsible for ourselves, then we can have a greater say in our future. Because if we're not, then we really don't have a say in our future. So do we want to have a say in our future? I want to have a say in mine.
You bet.
So I want to have that responsibility. I don't want someone else to take that responsibility from me. So I think it's important, because when I have my 401k, I can choose to invest it in something riskier or something safer. I can make those decisions. And I think every employee needs to make those decisions, because, as you say, the days of a guaranteed payout type of pension, as opposed to a guaranteed contribution pension, are over. And long time ago, actually. Absolutely. It's really just the remnants. States municipalities seem to be carrying these things for a longer period of time. And it's a very large burden. When the state put forth the pension system, they said they would pay 35% way back in the day. And, times changed and they weren't able to. So I think that to be doing the 15%, I know there was an effort to bring some of that back, or get some of that back from the state. I think it's good. I think having a safeguard in there again to make sure that the cities and towns spend it the way that it's intended is important, and it should be for tax relief, because again, it's money and you move things around. And when I was on the Board of Aldermen, I was amazed at some of the sneakiness, sneaky, underhanded stuff that went on a regular basis, because it's money and power. And believe me, if they can spend the money, they will.
Sure.
And right now, that additional fund, that additional requirement for the cities and towns to pay has been funded in Nashua. So the city found a way. What they did wasn't entirely above board and legal, in my opinion, but that's a court case that's being pursued. But it's been done, and the need isn't quite the same as it's been in the past.
Yeah, I would think that if a bill like this were to pass, that a good compromise would be, say, look, we're going to throw some more money into your pension plan. However, we're going to require you for new hires only to get into a different type of plan. And the type of plan that was being looked at by the legislature the past few terms was a hybrid plan, where you have, say, half the money guaranteed as a pension, and half would be into a 401k type of plan in your own name.
Right.
So if you moved on to another employer, that money is yours, and that's part of your nest egg.
I think it's a great idea. And again, it's good for the taxpayers because it reduces some of that burden, and it's good for the employee because it gives them the options. And I think we all need to have those options. Otherwise, we're not really controlling our future.
Right. And our needs change, right? Whether you're a young couple.
And who knows your needs?
That you know your needs, right? Not somebody mandating what is, whether we have, two incomes, no children,
Yeah.
right? That may morph over time, and those things. But I control that,
Yeah.
right? So.
Speaking about taxes, there's another important bill coming up for a vote Thursday. This is from the Ways and Means Committee, House Bill 185, which proposes to reduce the interest and dividends tax over 5 years down from its current level of 5%, 4, 3, 2, 1, and 0, blast off with no interest and dividends tax. This is a party line vote by the Ways and Means Committee. The Democrats voted 11-8 to support a repeal of the, well, let me say that a little differently. They voted to kill the bill. The bill was to repeal the tax. The Democrats voted kill the repeal. The Republicans voted to put this in place. And now it's coming up to a floor vote. This will be a fight on the floor in the legislature tomorrow. The issues are, it primarily affects seniors. I mean, if you're a young working person, you've got W-2 wages, there's no income tax, life is good for New Hampshire workers. Once you retire and you've built up a nest egg, you're not getting W-2 wages. But if you're responsible, you've built up a nest egg that has stocks, bonds, and CDs. Sure. That's interest, dividends, and capital gains. There's always an attempt to put a capital gains tax in place. And there's always an attempt to keep the interest and dividends tax as it is and not cut it back. But what this does, it's an income tax on seniors. So you pay no income tax when you're working. When you retire and have your kids are grown, you're not burning the school system. We talked about the capacity of New Hampshire schools. We're down about 2,000 kids
Nashua, right.
in Nashua alone. These seniors with no kids now in school are subsidizing the kids that are in school. And you want these folks to stay around and keep paying the property tax and not using the burden of that property tax.
Not move to Florida.
And not move to Florida.
Right.
And this is a bill to say, go to Florida, guys. You know,
Yeah.
We give you 5%.
Well, that combined with the other couple of things that are coming up, Bill, is terrible. I don't know what they think they're going to do, and who out there has all the money that they keep just looking to give it to the state or to the local entities to pay all these things. I mean, you mentioned that there's another bill in there for capital gains tax. There's also a bill for state income tax of only a couple percent. You know, that's
Secular, Carl.
That's it.
Yes. An avalanche starts with a pebble.
That's right.
Right. I mean, that's what it is. And once we get on there, there's no way to extricate ourselves out of it. There's just
Some of the trends that we've seen in the last few years in the state, in particular, we take a look at population movement, and our population growth has historically or recently been flat. You know, back in the day, the state was booming, and we liked that. People were coming in, they were finding jobs here, but it's been flatter in the last few years. I think with the exception of maybe the last year or two, we started seeing some of this. Some resurgence. We need people to come in here. We need to come in here and find jobs. We want them to stay. We don't want people to come in and others to move out because it gives you a net zero state growth. We can't have that. Vermont, I think shrank. That's very, very bad for a state economy.
And Maine's been declining.
What's that?
Maine population has been declining.
It's been declining. We don't want that to happen here. So this at the same time that in the last couple of years we did things to encourage business growth, and we actually saw a resurgence of immigration into the state, domestic immigration, from other states, people coming here into the state. Now we're jeopardizing that by saying, no, we're not going to make it quite so attractive for folks to stay. Because if 100 move in and 110 move out, that's net down. Right. And we need to do everything that we can to make Nashua and make New Hampshire competitive with our surrounding states.
We've seen that important. You grow the economy, you grow the income.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's the way you're supposed to operate, not tax everybody until they run away.
We want to have a bigger pie.
Yeah.
So the slices are more meaningful.
Because people don't need to stick around.
Right.
They don't need to.
Right.
Not today.
And all these states are in competition one with another. which is, I think, a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
So states are in competition. They're trying to get people to come in and stay. Folks who are retired, they may have a nice nest egg. They're going to maybe spend some money. They'll be buying a new car a little more frequently or whatever.
Going out to eat.
Exactly. So these are the folks that you want. You want people who have means to be living in your state. That's very, very important. And that these older folks who are retired, who aren't invested in Nashua or New Hampshire anymore, might say, well, Florida's looking pretty attractive. How about Florida? Or wherever else where these things don't exist. So I think it's a mistake. And I'm sorry to see, I'm not surprised to see that it's along party lines, but I'm sorry to see that so many elected officials are trying to, kill the golden goose.
Yeah.
It's not good. So we'll see what happens. I wonder what the governor would do if this passes.
Well, I'm hoping he, he vetoes some of these things because he can't. We can, if the Republicans stay together, we can keep that veto and maybe look at it in 2 years from now.
Right. So I'm very anxious to see what this vote is like tomorrow. Is it going to be along party lines throughout the entire House, and then what's going to happen in the Senate?
Right.
It's interesting.
Yep.
Well, there's a lot of other things that we wanted to discuss too.
Yeah. So just in following at the national level, we've sent one new and Congresswoman Custer for her fourth term, and some things. For those of us who saw the State of the Union, just when we saw the charade that was promulgated there with the suffragette movement and the white and stuff, and of course Annie raising the roof, which actually made the Boston Globe. To talk about her, but
it made Saturday Night Live too.
Oh yeah, SNL too, right? I was just reading an article today. I think Carla, you had sent me, is that one of the things is that she moved off the Veterans Committee and she's moved on to another one. And Chris Pappas now is sitting on the Veterans Committee, and of course we know that neither one of them have any military experience. And though I was reading an article, and even though she says she's done so many things, and even in the primary, when we had Dr. Levinson that was doing some yeoman things to try to turn things around at the Manchester VA. I was reading this article about the Los Angeles VA, which sits on like 330 acres, that they're actually renting some of the facility to things like the UCLA baseball stadium now sits on the VA property. Lots for movie theaters where they put some of their equipment and storage that are there. A lot of things, and they've said since 2012, they probably generated anywhere in a conservative number, $20 to $40 million. And the whole idea of this land that was donated back at the turn of the century to the Veterans Administration was to be able to house homeless vets. Mm-hmm. And they interviewed a young man who travels 140 miles. He can't bring his car in because he can't afford the gas, and he takes public transportation, isn't able to be seen, but yet he can hear baseball practice at the UCLA baseball stadium that's on VA grounds. And so I'm wondering, we now have a representative in Pappas that's sitting on the Veterans Committee. What kind of voice is he bringing, again, to be the voice of the veterans? This is not, this is long, people think, that this has just been happening over the last couple of years. I mean, this goes on decades that they're doing it. So it's really, as a veteran myself, it's just sad to see that still at the federal level, that now that they have control of the House, that the plight of the veteran is going to be even worse now, because they're not doing the things that they need to do to make sure that they take care of our veterans.
And I think you said that they don't know where the money goes.
They have no idea where the money would be able to have built facilities already to house hundreds of, and it's the largest veterans facility in the country. Uh-huh. And here they are, and here's a homeless vet that's on the outside of a wall, looking in, and he can't get the treatment that he needs. And it's and it's a fundamental disconnect with the people that are serving in Congress right now. We're not, military people are not pawns. Right. You don't like us when you need us.
They don't see the urgency.
Right. I mean, and we're losing, so many veterans a day. Right. And taking their lives. And this is, and in my opinion, the bureaucracy of the Veterans Administration is so large, that it's going to be crushed underneath its own weight. And it doesn't matter who the person you put at the top, because by the time any of that direction gets down to the people
some years to get down.
Forget about it. And by that time, the things have changed and the direction has changed. And it just, I'm a little disappointed that we now have another non-veteran on a veteran committee. that really doesn't have things in context, you know, and of course they'll take credit, you know, because they'll go to a parade, right, or they'll take a photo op with somebody from a VFW, but it's much more than that. It's much deeper than that. It isn't about us being used as props, you know, is that, you know, and we're going to have more and more veterans because, you know, we've had this prolonged, you know, issue in the Middle East, and that if you think the problem is bad now, go 20 years down the road,
right,
and you're going to figure out if this thing isn't double the situation that we're looking at. So,
well, that's one of the things that you have with all federal programs, not just the VA.
Right.
They don't look at the really organization, how well it's functioning.
Right.
And if they find problems, they don't bother correcting them because they'll take a 5-10% error.
Sure. Right. I mean, it's a self-licking ice cream cone. You know, you know that if you become more efficient, then maybe your position isn't necessary. Right. When you look at the ratio of administrators to patient in the Veterans Administration, I forget what the number was, but the ratio was just, how can I have 14 administrators to one patient?
Right.
And I'm not talking doctors.
No,
we haven't even gotten to talk to the doctor. I'm talking administrators. So you have this huge monolithic entity that's supposed to be responsive to a veteran, and we just can't get out of our own way. And you know, and we now have a new congressman that's out there that I really, you know, he's going to be a deer in the headlights look. You know, he's not, you know, there's no context for him. So, and you know, and I know that Representative Custer touted a lot of, you know, successes throughout the VA, and it was very hard for us to figure out what those were. We were trying to figure out what was going on. So. Yeah.
Well, let's hope we can solve some of these problems or get them solved somehow.
At least bring them to the forefront, you know.
Have we heard anything about the VA here in New Hampshire?
Well, it's funny. I was talking to Dr. Levinson maybe a couple of weeks ago, and he actually was spending a lot of time because the VA's Inspector General refuted all of the whistleblowers' accusations for like, okay, well, do we expect anything less? You know, the VA Inspector General isn't going to say, oh, yeah, they're right. Yeah, we were bad, you know. So Dr. Levinson is still working on that to try to move that forward. I believe that, you know, more attention has gotten focus on it. We have some success stories just across the river in White River Junction. The VA hospital there is amazing, you know, and we should look at that and lessons learned. I think Dr. Montoya, who's now in Manchester, is doing what he can. But, you know, you can't, it's tough to turn that kind of ship that's been there so long. You know, it's going to take a complete sea state change to be able to do that. But it's the idea is there's a focus on it, and not just Manchester. It's the VA as a whole. And I think that needs to do that. And the President Trump has made leaps and bounds about making sure that he puts money there, to put administrators there, to make sure that he's got a focus on the VA, and to make sure that we try to do whatever we can to help our veterans.
Well, I certainly hope in the next 2 years we see some of these results, the positive results, because I know there's a lot of errors there.
There are.
In New Hampshire and elsewhere.
There is. You know, and it's all about, and it's a word that I hear all the time, it's about accountability.
Right.
It's about, you know, if I put you in a position of responsibility, then whatever hits the fan, the first person I'm coming to is you. Right? You're the one that was put in charge. And if you can't do it, you know, as a businessman, then thank you very much for your effort. I appreciate your interest in national defense and our veterans, but you're not the person. And put somebody in there. But it's got to be all the way from the top to the bottom. What I've heard some great stories is that Dr. Montoya will just leave and get out from behind his desk, walk through the hospital, sit down, see a veteran waiting, and sit down and talk to him. That means something.
That's what you need to do.
That's exactly what, you know, you're not going to find that on a PowerPoint chart, how many visits, you know, how many veterans did he talk to? But it starts a culture. It starts a culture that this entity cares about the veterans. And so here's the top schnitzel, and he's coming down to hear from the people that are actually getting the service that his hospital's providing, and we need more of that. Absolutely.
Well, that's like a president that goes around in his factory once in a while.
You bet.
And talks to the people down there.
That's right.
Find out what the problem is.
One of the influences that president has, though, is competition.
Yeah.
And it keeps him walking that floor, the shop floor, because he needs to know where the mistakes are.
And unfiltered.
Unfiltered.
Right? I mean, you got to get it from the horse's mouth, because if it goes up the chain, because nobody wants to tell the boss bad news.
Right.
Right. So
especially if they're the bad news.
If they're the bad news, that's right. Nobody wants. That's right.
But the problem with a lot of government entities, unfortunately, just the nature of it, is that they don't really compete. There's only one VA.
Right.
There's not VAA and B, you know, where they're competing against each other for the patients and for costs and trying to find the most efficient way to service the most number of people. They're not doing that.
That's right.
It really becomes an inbox and an outbox. My job is to move stuff from here over there.
Right.
Let's not do it too fast because then maybe they don't need me.
That's exactly true.
And this happens all the time.
Right.
I think there are some entities maybe where things aren't quite like that. I look at our Nashua Police Department, a great police department. You know, they're doing things differently. They're out there competing with the criminal element all the time. That's their competition. Fire department, they're out there trying to keep houses from burning down. But any other agency where they're providing a service where there's no competition.
Right.
I consider schools, or you consider sometimes public works in certain places. I think we have good public works here. But you look at some, and VA, and you look at these things, and it is not the boss who's walking around trying to find out how do we make a little bit more. It's maybe someone walking around saying, how do we do enough to make sure we get the budget appropriation next year that we'd like to have? We talked about that a little bit last time. It's just very, very hard outside of a competitive environment to get more money by performing well.
Right.
If you perform well, maybe you don't need so much.
Correct.
And that's the problem.
It is, and it isn't about throwing money at it. You know,
But that seems to be
that's of course that's what they want to do. You know, and especially now that you've got a very a different view from Congress right now. You know, that the first thing they want to do is that everybody was handed a pen and a checkbook, and it's not the way. I mean, you're never going to fix a problem that way. You know, because that's not what a veteran needs. You know, it isn't. It's a veteran needs is that, and we talked about this, is that about let him or her have an ability to go anywhere they want to. You know, I mean, everybody talks about just a card, and it's a debt owed. You know, we've asked them, and we have, you know, when we send men and women overseas and they come back and they see some things that they probably would rather not have seen, but they did. And they raised their right hand voluntarily. And for us to turn our backs on them and to make it hard for them, you know, I heard stories of people here in our state that would drive 2 hours to go down to Manchester or even down to Boston and not get seen and get back on the bus and go back and then have to wait next month to do it. You know, when that young man or woman was doing something wherever they were deployed, you know, we asked them to do something and they did it, no questions asked, and we owe that to them as well. You know, so it's a problem that I think that will always be in front of us, but I think we need to do some things to get it fixed. And I think President Trump has done some things to be able to do that, but we're a long way from solving the problem. And then the other thing talked about today was just, you know, this the government shutdown that's looming again. About, you know, did we get out of the negotiations what the president wanted to build on the wall? And it's really fun. I gotta say, everybody thinks that, you know, that what the president's trying to do is just buy a brick program and all he wants is a wall. You know, he says it's a wall, but it's a wall in some areas. You know, it's technology in others. It's more manpower in others. You know, his point, and everybody just wants to say it's a wall, and they think that all he wants to do is just build this unscalable wall. It's to him, and I agree with him 100%, it's a security issue. Right. About who's coming in. And Dinesh D'Souza on Monday said the exact same thing. You know, he says it's about, you know, people always mix illegals with immigrants. And those are two separate categories. There's an immigrant is somebody who comes here, has a process, waits in line. He goes, nobody wants, I mean, even the immigrants are here. And I said this on the campaign trail. Nobody wants people to jump in front of you, right? And that's what happens, right? And it creates a burden. And one of the things that they try to frame the argument is that the president doesn't like immigrants in this country, which he's never said that, you know, but that's the only argument that they have, you know, is to try and fan the flame and say, you know, he's trying to do some things against some decent people. And that's not the case. You know, we don't even know sometimes what country they're coming from. Right. And so, you know, I believe that whatever the preliminary discussions are of this wall, from a financial perspective, doesn't make the president happy. You know, but he's a negotiator and we'll figure out, but he's got a base, you know, and he had a campaign promise and he's holding firm. And so I think he's going to hold the new speaker and the majority of the House, you know, feet to the fire.
Well, another point is that the new budget for 2020 or 2021 is coming up next October. So really, you're only looking from now to October.
Right.
How much money can you use in that time?
Yep.
And then you got to get some more. So we're going to go through that again when they vote for the next fiscal years.
Right.
I think I'd like to talk a bit about the barrier topic that you talked about.
Yes, sir.
Steve. It's the problem is not really the immigration. The problem is the criminal element in the border
Right.
in Mexico. There's a huge drug trade. El Chapo just got convicted,
Right.
and a lot of the details of his means getting drugs into the country have been exposed. And basically, you've got a large criminal element in Mexico that's right on the border in Tijuana, in Juarez, and without the means of a barrier, that violence spills over into our country. And now with the barrier in those two areas, the violence has subsided greatly in San Diego, greatly in El Paso, even though it's still very violent across the borders. So I think you need to look at the quality of life for the people living on the border when you have this essentially drug overrunning traffickers trying to get both drug and people into the country of ours,
Right.
and impacting our quality of life.
Well, that's why he's
Common
looking
sense.
just to extend the length of the
Sure.
of the barriers. I mean, because you go 50 miles from El Paso, and you got open areas.
Right.
Right.
And
So they're
you
not going to cross with the barriers.
No.
They're going to cross where there's no
Right.
barrier.
Right.
Go around.
And it
they're
would make
try-
sense to extend that barrier.
Right.
And-
It's funny. And what we're hearing, you're hearing some of the rhetoric right now in Congress is like, they just believe that when, and it's a term, right? It's just the terminology that when he says wall, it's multifaceted, but their argument is that, well, we can't extend a physical barrier, through the Rio Grande all the way through. I mean, you can't. I mean, in New Mexico or Arizona, I forgot what state, they had the largest fentanyl bust in the history, enough to kill 35 million Americans. Right. So, people were saying, oh, you guys are overreacting. All you Republicans believe that, that everybody wants to come to this country is bad. We never say that. But we need to start pushing back on them and say, you know what? One life is one life too many. And it's not just like the largest importer of fentanyl isn't from the Mexican cartel, it's from China. So, when the president talks about border security, everybody focus on there, but there's elements of that to talk about our airports, our seaports. It's everything, and even our northern border.
And it's just not the border too. They get
Right.
spread out real
Absolutely.
quickly.
And so, they try to pigeonhole us into an argument, you just don't want to let this poor downtrodden, Latin family in, and it's much broader than that, but that's what they get, and it fans the flames. And me as a direct descendant of a Mexican immigrant who came across legally, we take great umbrage, with people trying to categorize my people, number one, is that, they're all illegals. Well, we're not all illegals, and there are some of us that follow the process. And there's a reason why it's important to a person like my grandfather who becomes a citizen. Now, not everybody needs to become a citizen, right? There's ways to come in here, but those people always, they try to characterize everybody as one group of people, and it's not. And those that line jump, right? We get very angry, right? Because we're doing it the right way, because it's meaningful that way. And this talk with Pelosi and open borders and stuff is very scary. It's very scary. And once they're in, the element that's in, how are you going to root them out?
Very, very hard to find them.
Right.
Hard to find them is right.
Sure.
You
Very,
don't
very hard
know
to
where
find
they
them.
are.
But it's all politics. And I think you used the phrase a couple of times of fanning the flames. They're doing whatever they can to fan those flames to create an emotional argument. And
Correct.
one of the ways that we're going to get beyond some of these stalemates that we have on some of these issues and really get to some solutions is to try to crush the flames, put them out, and deal with these things on a logical basis. It's hard to get there because the other side, and I'm going to say the other side, is focused more on that emotional argument than they are on anything. Because their goal, again, we always kind of wonder what's the left hand doing, whether the right hand is doing something else. And the end game, I think, for the Democrats in Washington, and maybe locally too, I think locally too, is to punish Trump, is to make him pay some kind of a price. And the willingness to do anything to affect that end is very dangerous for all of us, because things that are so vital, I mean, it's very, very clear that the wall works. You have all these Democrats in Washington who, over the course of the last few years, have said emphatically, we need more border protection. We need more. We need the wall.
Right. And have voted for it previously.
And have voted for it.
Right.
They have voted for it when it was to their advantage.
Absolutely.
But now they're willing to sacrifice what they knew was good. And I think what deep inside they still know is good.
Right.
In order to exact some kind of price for Trump. And that's very, very dangerous.
It is.
It's all emotion, and we have to get away from that. And the logical argument would say, as you've said, that cutting in line is not good.
Right.
That immigration is good.
Correct.
But that illegals is bad.
Right.
And there's an element that comes across where there's drugs, and we know what the drug problem is like, or whatever else.
Right.
It's bad, and we need to protect ourselves from that. That's what a country is and does.
You talked about paying the price. Well, who's paying the price for the land criminals?
Sure.
Yeah.
What bothers me too is that they don't want to sit down and solve the immigration problem, come up with better rules and regulations for the immigrants.
They don't. They want their victory, and their victory is
Their
only
first
against
answer is
Trump.
no.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's their first counter.
Before they even hear the
That's right. Is
the
no.
idea.
Right. You know, it would surprise me if they were waiting in line at a movie theater or waiting in line at the gas pump, and all of a sudden somebody just walked in and went straight to the head of the line to get the same thing that they were waiting for. If they would have the same feeling and say, it's okay. You know, let have a free for all and let everybody just rush, the ticket agents at a movie theater. And then some people don't even go to the ticket theater. They just go into the movie theater.
They don't pay at all.
And then you go in after you paid your ticket, and guess what?
No seats.
No seats. Right? It's really that simple. But they don't want to look at it that way because there's no counter argument to that. Because they would tell you, no, I paid this outlandish price for movies, right? I should get a seat. Yeah. Same thing in immigration. If I stand in line and I do the process, then I should be allowed into this country. But it's funny when it's beneficial to them to have a counter argument, if you will. They'll never listen to just the basic fundamental issue of what we're talking about.
Well, I think we just saw how they back off of something. They were pushing and getting all these youngsters that came over illegally considered. But all of a sudden, it wasn't in this last negotiation at all.
Right.
They didn't bring it in. They stopped fighting for that.
Sure.
Because it was a fake argument.
Right. And it doesn't promote
that's right.
Their position forward. Absolutely right.
And Trump had actually, in one of his previous iterations, said they offered something on that topic.
Right.
And so once he offers it, they don't want it.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's just the most unproductive.
And it's the same way locally too. I mean, what we see right now, I'm afraid for our city. Yeah. Because there's no counterbalance. And part of, I think, any kind of legislation is there's got to be some kind of, now shame on us as Republicans that we didn't win some seats. That's we need to look internally about that. But, what we have right now, and you have some people out there that are, we saw that what happened with the library. With what they wanted to do with the library. And then you have people quoting and misquoting, and they weren't even at the event. Yeah. So those are the kind of things that scare me about, and they're they have 100% of the seats, here. So from a state legislative perspective. So,
Well, I worry about on the Board of Education too. That's another serious problem we have. As you said before, we have a declining student body and a very high increasing cost of
we have budgets that go up every single year, and every year our enrollment is down further. One thing I like about the charter schools, one thing that I think is part
Did you say that out loud?
I did. I like the charter schools. I toured in both of those schools, and it's really amazing what they can do on a very limited budget. But one of the things that is true there is that their charter says they have a certain number of seats, let's say 500 seats. If they only have 450 kids, they don't get enough money for 500. They get enough money for 450 because they are paid on a per seat occupied basis. Right. Their budget has to scale up and down based on how many kids are there. It's one of the reasons why they always want to have
full enrollment, right?
A waiting list. Full enrollment is because they need that. They don't want to be at $499 if their number is 500. It's very important to them. Because if it is $499, they're not going to get one of those tuition seats paid for. But our regular public schools, that's not the case. And we see enrollment go down and we see the budget go up. And so we see an ever increasing amount per kid that's spent. And it's double. It's double what the charter schools get. Because the charter schools, it's by mandate from the state legislature. mandated you get this much money at $6,000 or $7,000, whatever the number is, per occupied seat.
Right.
And if the kid's not there, they don't get it. And here it's $14,000, and it's whether the seat's occupied or not.
Plus the fact that charter schools paying for rent, property
They pay
tax,
property tax.
all those things that
Yes.
go on, that's a lot higher than the expenses for the regular schools
That's
because
right.
they get it all free.
And having paid twice as much for the public school expense than the charter school expense, do you see any benefit on the performance of the student? Any
Well,
difference?
you know, that was always a tough subject in the Board of Aldermen. Clearly, some kids in Nashua do well.
Yeah.
We have
Yep.
all the AP students. We have some kids who do very well. But our district overall is ranked in the bottom 30% of the state. And that's done by test scores. And so while we have a slice, maybe 15%, 10 or 15% at the top who are doing very well, the other 85% are not doing well. And it's that 85% that draws down our average to the bottom third of the state. And that just is wrong. And some of the kids that are in that bottom third are able to go to charter schools and they excel.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the key here is that it's not one size fits all. It's not, every kid is not the same. And yet we have a Board of Education and some members on the Board of Education who I think speak wisely and clearly, and others who speak only for the system.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's politics and money and influence. Right. And I think there's more interest in keeping a system well-funded than there is in making that system perform.
Right.
Again, because there's no competition, and they're deathly afraid of competition. That's, I think, one of the efforts we're going to see in Concord is to get rid of the scholarship fund, and maybe
That's right.
curtail charter schools, because those elements provide competition, better results at a lower cost, and the argument that it takes money away from the school district is a false flag.
Right.
What it really does is it embarrasses the school district, because it shows that the kid who didn't perform well here didn't not perform well because of something innate with him or his family or whatever, but it was something wrong with the school
Same
environment.
kid, different school.
Sure.
Right.
Right.
They try to, again, use one way of doing it for everybody.
Right.
And you got so many different grades of different problems with different
right.
children.
Right.
They learn differently. They react differently.
Sure.
And I've been to the two in here in Nashua also, and it's excellent to see how well they like to.
And I don't know why people are so afraid of choice.
Yeah.
Of whatever, as a parent,
Right.
my wife and I, we had kids that went to private school, we had kids that went to public school, and we had kids that went to Catholic school. And what we've realized is that first of all, the parents need to be involved.
Yes.
Right.
Definitely.
It isn't, school is not a babysitting class, right? So the parents need to be actively involved. And what I have found is somebody have asked me, and not that they were trying to pin me, but they think that I would have a belief that if I sent a child to a private school, if I sent one of our children to a Catholic school, that by definition, I believe that they were going to be better. The truth of the matter is, it's what the child puts in is what the child gets out. Mm-hmm. And we had two kids that went to Bishop Girton, and then we had one son that went to Nashua South, because we as parents felt that what was in the best interest of my child, how he or she was going to learn better. And there were some phenomenal students that came out of the public schools in Nashua High, phenomenal. Mm-hmm. And we had some phenomenal kids that came out of Bishop Girton. So, it isn't that if you go there, you're not going to exceed or excel. If you go over there, you're not going to excel. I think it is a combination of where we have lost our way in this country, that, that it was a teacher and a parent and a student. That's a triangulation, right? It's not just a teacher, right? I'm not abdicating my role as a parent just because I drop my child off at 7:30 in the morning, right? I have a responsibility as well. That child has a responsibility that well, and the teacher has a responsibility. And we used to tell our kids all the time, you know what? I pay property taxes and I'm paying private tuition. They work for you. The teacher works for you. You, the student. It's up to you to reach out to them, because you know what? Inherently, every teacher, no matter what school, wants to do the right thing and teach that child. But all of a sudden now we get wrapped into this overall programmatic of an institution, and we want to keep the sanctity of that institution without realizing what is the benefit that we're trying to generate for the child. And I think we've lost our way when it comes to, and when they attack us as parents about taking money away and taking away from the public schools. I don't buy that, never have and never will.
And you need an administrator that looks at that
Absolutely.
the same way.
Absolutely.
That he's looking that it's an individual circle. If
You
will.
bet. You bet. It isn't. I remember. When I would come home with a note from my teacher because I may have done something that wasn't kosher, and my dad's answer was never, "Don't listen to her."
Yeah.
My dad's answer was, "What are you doing in that class that generated this note?" Right? It isn't the teacher's fault.
Yeah.
He looked squarely at the foot of the individual that was either doing or not doing the work, which was me. And I think that's something. And we ask these teachers to do a lot of things with very little. And for the most part, these teachers, I salute them. My sister-in-law's a teacher. God love them. It's amazing. And their ability to get the most out of children is amazing. We, as taxpayers and the Board of Education, the alderman and the mayor, need to give the teachers everything that they need to make sure that they're producing the best student possible. Because at the end of the day, that's what they feel is their charter, or they wouldn't have gone into teaching.
Right.
One of the things I have to point out, we hear that argument a lot, is that everything that's needed in the charter school costs about $7,000 per kid per year. And everything that's needed in the regular public school apparently it's more than $14,000 because they want more every time.
Right.
And we got to watch out for that.
Right.
Because that's one thing that the charter school and the private school too shows us. They show us this is what we can do with this much money.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think I'd like to summarize our conversation by saying a lot of what we talked about are choices made by your elected representatives at the State House, in Congress, at the Board of Aldermen.
Yeah.
If you've got concerns on these topics, talk to your state representatives, talk to your local representatives, talk to your congressperson, because their job is to have the government work for you, not the other way around.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to thank very much
Thank you, Bill.
my colleagues Steve Negron, Dave Schoneman, Carl Seidel,
Thank you, Bill.
and I'm Bill Ohm for The People's View. See you next time.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.